Today we're discussing Christian Science and Mary Baker Eddy. Christian Science isn't really an influence on culture or really much in the world today. Its numbers have fallen off. And the thing about Christian Science is it's really neither Christian nor is it scientific. But let's talk about it. This is the Lost Mission Podcast. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the show. My name is Don Van Zant, and this is the Lost Mission Podcast, where our goal is to help us as believers get back to our mission of knowing and sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ. Thanks for joining us today. So like I said at the top of the show, we are talking about Christian Science today. This is our series on cults and fringe groups. I say cults and fringe groups because every group that we discuss may not necessarily be viewed as a cult, at least as what we would consider to be a cult, because a cult is so hard to define. And so some of these groups will be considered a fringe group. But today's group is likely a cult. It has been considered a cult basically from the beginning, since it was founded in the 1800s by Mary Baker Eddy. But who is that? Who are we talking about? Today we're talking about Christian Science. So let's get into it. Okay, Christian Science. Before we get into the discussion and the history of the group, let's talk about present-day Christian Science and maybe a few popular and famous names that you may recognize that are either directly or indirectly associated with Christian Science. Who are some famous Christian scientists? Number one, Val Kilmer. We all love Val. We think Val Kilmer is great, and I think that everyone seems to be in agreement that we feel terrible for Val Kilmer and his current health condition. But he had this to say about his own situation. He first wouldn't recognize his throat cancer as being real. He wouldn't accept the diagnosis that he might have throat cancer, but rather looked at it as just a suggestion due to his Christian Science beliefs. He wouldn't accept it as a reality. Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe claimed to be immortal. There's actually a handwritten letter that I believe is up for bid, maybe on eBay. Feel free to look that up and check it out. That she made claims that she did not live in immortal bodies. She was immortal. Ellen DeGeneres. Now, Ellen DeGeneres isn't necessarily one that we would say is a Christian Scientist, but she was raised in a Christian Science family. Her home was Christian Science. Her parents were Christian Scientists, and she's actually quoted as having said this, that she had a terrible accident when she was around 10 years old, needed medical intervention. This is the quote. She says, "I split my knee open, and my bone was exposed. And my dad told me to know the truth." And I said, well, the truth is my bone is exposing its material self to the material world. Help me. And then I passed out. So that's Ellen DeGeneres. Robin Williams, the late, great Robin Williams, one of his parents was a Christian Scientist. I believe that Robin Williams actually identified as an Episcopalian, called himself Catholic Light. So Robin Williams wasn't a Christian Scientist, but had ties back to the Christian Science Church. Kelsey Grammer, Liz Taylor, Audrey Hepburn, all names that you hear associated with Christian Science. But I really think probably the most interesting, and this person is not directly related to Christian Science, so don't misunderstand me here when I drop this name in a moment. They are not a Christian Scientist. They don't believe in Christian Science, but much of what Christian Science teaches has molded and has sort of shaped this person's thinking, that sort of new thought of the late 1800s spilling over into the Word of Faith movement of modern day. And that person is former President Donald Trump. Okay, so while not strictly tied to Christian Science, he is definitely affected by this new thought and the Word of Faith movement. His spiritual advisor, Paula White, you can look through videos and see Paula White standing behind President Trump while he is giving speeches. Paula White speaks of going to the White House and basically declaring that anything that President Trump says is akin to the same thing as God saying it.
To say no to President Trump would be saying no to God, and therefore, and I won't.
Even President Trump, you can look through old videos, see him making claims that he believed that the coronavirus, that COVID, would just magically disappear as though it were some sort of miracle.
It's going to disappear. One day it's like a miracle. It will disappear. And from our shores, it could get worse before it gets better. It could maybe go away. We'll see what happens.
So while President Trump was not a Christian Scientist, you can see those influences sort of in the life of Donald Trump. Very interesting to me because Trump, from what I understand, claims to be an evangelical Christian. But you can see how that Paula White and these Word of Faith teachers have influenced Donald Trump. Word of Faith is not Christian Science, but they're sort of cut out of the same cloth. Before we get into the conversation surrounding Christian Science, if you like this channel, if you like this video, please consider liking the video, sharing the video, and subscribing to the channel. That way you can keep up with all of the videos as they're released. Hit the bell notification so that you can see when they are released, and it really helps our channel a lot. So I appreciate it, guys. All right, Christian Science, its history and its origins. During and just after what was referred to as the Second Great Awakening of the late 18th century, early 19th centuries, a time of great revival occurred in the United States. This was a time of great emotion, a time of excitement, very revivalistic. This brought the rise of such preachers as Charles Finney. It saw the rise of the Adventist movements. So Seventh-day Adventism was born through the Second Great Awakening. The holiness movements, later the Pentecostal holiness movements, were born during and after the sort of Second Great Awakening. Also, there was a large increase in membership in Baptist and Methodist churches during this time. So the Second Great Awakening was a great time of revival in America. But it also, through this time, we see the rise of several cultic and fringe-type groups during this period. Matter of fact, Dr. Anthony Hoekema, in his book, The Four Major Cults, lists 4 groups. He wrote an entire book on 4 groups that arose out of this sort of post-Second Great Awakening, or maybe during the Second Great Awakening period. These groups were the Mormons, the Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, and the Christian Scientists, who we're going to discuss today. We've already done episodes on Jehovah's Witnesses and on Seventh-day Adventism. If you're interested in those, go back through the channel. You'll see what I'm talking about there. We haven't done one on Mormons yet, on the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but we may talk about them. But the 4th group that Dr. Anthony Hoekema discusses is the Christian Science group. Who are they? Christian Science was founded in 1879 by Mary Baker Eddy. So if we're going to talk about Christian Science, it's unavoidable that you're going to have to discuss Mary Baker Eddy. Who is this person? Who was she? She's the central figure of Christian Science. Then and now, she is still the founder and the primary focus of the group. But who is she? Mary Baker Eddy, Mother Mary, as she would be known in later years by her followers, Mary Ann Morse Baker, was born in New Hampshire in 1821. The youngest of 6 children, Mary grew up in a strict Calvinistic home. Her father was a sort of a hardworking, somewhat stubborn man. He enjoyed debating the finer points of Calvinism. Mark Baker, her father. Her mother, though, was quite the opposite. She wasn't so strict. She wasn't quite as stubborn as her husband Mark was. But Abigail, at the same time, was very intelligent, very intellectual. But she seemed to be the sort of softer touch in Mary's life. Quiet, reserved. Those were the parents of Mary Baker Eddy. She has 5 siblings. She's the youngest of the 6. By all indications, Mary, though, was the favorite. Her mother loved her. Her siblings adored her. There is some report that maybe there was a conflicted relationship between Mary and her father. It just depends really the sources that you read. I wish I had a concrete answer to give you guys on that one because I don't really know. So some say that Mary had a sort of strained relationship with her father, and this volatility actually led to many of her childhood illnesses. Whether that's true or not, again, it's unclear. But it is true that Mary had her fair share of ailments. As a child, Mary was very sickly. Mary didn't have the best of health. which would lead her into later on wanting to venture into understanding health and the nature of health. But others, like I said, they say that she was the favorite child and that her birth brought great joy and great happiness to the Baker household. Her siblings adored her. Her mother adored her. Matter of fact, her mother, Abigail, is actually quoted as having said, "Sometimes I fear I worship Mary instead of the great Jehovah." So her mother loved Mary, greatly loved her, until Mary was almost an idol to her mother. But at any rate, Mary grows up in a strict home, a strict Calvinistic upbringing. She was also very sick. Her ailments included spinal issues and seizures that were really quite frightening. On the one hand, Mary would at times scream and roll on the ground in fits and in seizures. And then at other time, Mary would just drop and lay motionless on the ground. Sort of the pendulum would swing from one extreme to the other in Mary's sickness and her ailment as a child. And I'm certain that growing up, this was terrifying in her home. They never knew what was going to happen to Mary. She had these health issues, but they didn't know whether it would manifest in such a way that Mary would be kicking and screaming on the floor, or whether she would just drop and become almost catatonic and that nobody knew what to do with her. So she had some challenges growing up. But Mary would grow up and live as normal of a life as possible, join a Congregationalist church, begin to adopt her father's Calvinistic views, and she would actually marry 3 different times throughout her life. So Mary has 3 marriages, and each one is of different significance to her. Let's talk about Mary Baker Eddy and her different marriages, all right? In 1843, at the age of 22, Mary married her first husband, George W. Glover. And Glover seemed to be sort of a childhood crush of Mary's. He was several years older than her. I want to say 10, maybe 11 years older than Mary. She meets him when she's a young girl, develops this sort of crush. Then Mary grows up and becomes known as sort of the beauty of the town and catches George Glover's eye as an adult young woman. And so Glover becomes attracted to Mary, and there's this love story that plays out between the older man, the younger woman, the beauty of the town, and they get married. So it was this coming together of youth and beauty that attracted Glover to Mary. But sadly, George would die just a few months, 6-7 months, after he and Mary were wed. But however, in this short period of time, their union did produce one child, Mary's only child, a son whom she named George after his father. And Mary, as young as she was, around 22 years old at the time of her marriage to George, she has these health issues. Then her husband becomes sick, and he dies. And then she has a child. It's almost more than Mary can handle in her youth. I don't know if you could say Mary has a mental breakdown. You could say that just it all kind of gets to her. It's a sort of post-traumatic stress that she deals with. And I don't make light of that in any way. Post-traumatic stress is a very real thing. And people deal with that. When they go through grief, when they lose a loved one, they deal with health issues. All of this comes crashing in on Mary at a very, very young age. And to that end, to that extent, my heart actually goes out to the young Mary. She begins taking morphine, though, to help with the pain. Now, some would say she becomes addicted to morphine. Some would say that she becomes, I've even heard the term dope addict associated with Mary. I'm not going to say that. That seems to be off-putting. That's not my goal. That's not what I'm trying to say when it comes to Mary. But she did start to take morphine. But the morphine, really, it did little to help Mary's mental state. She had mental issues associated, obviously, with the seizures, obviously with the death of her husband, and now bringing this child. Mary is dealing with mental battles of her own. And as a result of this, over a course of time, Mary would lose custody of her son. He would move out west and eventually lose all contact with his mother, Mary. So now Mary no longer has a child in her life. Did Mary do this on purpose? I don't know. Was it some design of hers? I don't know. There's very little to be said or that I could find about the relationship between Mary and her son George. but he does go out of her life very, very early on. So Mary's early years were quite difficult, and she goes on in life. Years later, she marries for the second time. Her second husband was a gentleman by the name of Daniel Patterson, whom she would marry in 1853. And her health issues still persisted through this time. It was believed that Mary was so ill the day of the wedding that Patterson actually had to go upstairs and carry Mary down to the ceremony. And when the ceremony was completed, he takes Mary back up the stairs again, and he goes back to his home for several more months while Mary is under the care of her sister being nourished back to health. But eventually, she is able to go and to begin her life with Patterson. And they would stay married for some years. And it did seem that there was at least some sort of physical attraction between the two. Obviously, Mary was known as a beautiful woman, and this Mr. Patterson was sort of a ladies' man of the time. Later, he would be captured during the Civil War by Confederate soldiers. He would spend some time in prison. And it was during his time in prison that Mary meets the most important man in her life. This man wasn't one of her husbands. So she's been married twice at this point, and now she meets this other individual that just has such a drastic and a dramatic impact on Mary Baker Eddy. While her second husband was in prison, Mary met Dr. Phineas Parkhurst Quimby. This man, like I said, would impact her in a way that nobody else would. As far as I can tell, there were never any accusations of infidelity on either her part or of Quimby's part. There was never any talk of adultery. The relationship seemed to be completely platonic. They just knew each other, and he was more of a mentor than anything. But Quimby was a sort of self-proclaimed healer. Maybe not a faith healer, but a healer. His methods he used for healing included hypnotism as well as the power of suggestion. And this really impacted Mary because she had struggled with health issues, and now she meets this man that tries to hypnotize possibly her, but definitely others, uses the power of suggestion. And she's so influenced by him that later on she would actually be accused of plagiarizing much of Quimby's work. So Mary is the founder of Christian Science. But in truth and in reality, you could almost say that Quimby was the founder of Christian Science because Mary is accused of just plagiarizing a lot of Quimby's work. So while Mary Baker Eddy claimed her works to be original and even God-inspired, there's strong evidence that she simply plagiarized much of Quimby's work. Let me give us a couple of examples. So Quimby, he referred to his work as the science of the Christ. Mary Baker Eddy refers to her religion as Christian Science. Quimby, this is a quote from Quimby, disease being made by our belief. Mary Baker Eddy is quoted as saying disease being a belief. Another quote from Quimby, Quimby, the idea man is the highest, hence the image of God or the principle. Mary Baker Eddy, man was and is God's idea. Man is the divine principle. Quimby, error is matter. Mary Baker Eddy, matter is mortal error. So you can see how that one could speculate that Mary Baker Eddy just plagiarized a lot of Quimby's work. I'll let you draw your own conclusions as to what you may or may not think about that, but there's at least some speculation surrounding that idea. But the most important event in all of Mary Baker Eddy's life was her famous ice fall. Now, if you studied Christian Science at all, or if you practice Christian Science, which I understand their numbers are very much down in modern times, but if you practice Christian Science, you know about Mary and her famous fall. But what happened? Okay, so Quimby's teachings became very important to Mary after her ice fall. This is when it becomes important to her. I believe that Quimby was already dead by this time. But on February the 1st, 1866, Mary has some sort of an accident. We don't really know exactly what happened. We know she slips and she falls on the ice. That's the extent of the information that I have on it. I don't know what Mary was doing. I don't know why she was outside, but she slips and she falls. So the details surrounding the fall are a bit murky, but it is true that Mary had some sort of accident where she slipped and fell on the ice. Not uncommon for a lady that lived in the region of the country where Mary Baker lived. While recovering from this fall, she began to read her Bible, began to read of Jesus healing miracles. And while reading, her health instantly is restored, and Mary Baker Eddy is cured. That's Mary Baker Eddy's version of the story. But from the Kingdom of the Cults by Dr. Walter Martin, this is what he has to say about that instance. According to an authorized statement published by the Christian Science Publishing Society of Boston, Eddy, after a fall on a slippery sidewalk on February 1st, 1866, was pronounced, quote, incurable, and given 3 days to live by the attending physician, Dr. Alvin M. Cushing. The third day, allegedly her last on earth, Eddy, the statement makes out, cried for a Bible, read Matthew 9:2, and rose completely healed. Thus, the statement claims she discovered Christian Science. This is the story maintained by the organization today. As a comment on the First Church of Christ Scientists website states, in 1866, Eddy was severely injured in a fall, turned to the Bible as she had been accustomed to doing. All she had pondered in the past came strongly and clearly to her as she read an account of Jesus' healings. She was immediately healed. Convinced that God had healed her, she spent the next several years searching the scriptures to understand the principle behind her healing. She named her discovery Christian Science and explained it in 1875 when she first wrote Science and Health. So notice here something about the way that Mary Baker Eddy phrases what happens to her. She makes her healing a matter of discovery and not a matter of faith. But why is this distinction important? Why is it important that we understand that for Mary Baker Eddy, it was not just a matter of faith, but it was a matter of discovery? Let me give you a few reasons why. Faith and discovery are not the same thing. Faith relies on God. We understand that in order to have faith, we look to a higher authority, a higher power in Christianity, that higher power being God, that we look to God for healing. But discovery relies on man or even on his works. So faith and discovery, number one, are not the same thing. Number two, it teaches a belief of works, discovery, rather than a relying on of God, which is faith. And number three, it's simply untrue. One cannot discover themselves better or healed. No amount of reading, no amount of discovery will make one better as long as there is a true illness there. There can be a placebo effect where one may not necessarily have a specific illness, but they are given some sort or form of treatment to treat the supposed illness, which doesn't even exist, and they're made better. Doctors do this regularly. That they will give somebody what is considered a placebo that makes them better when really there's no illness there in the first place. So was Mary a hypochondriac? I don't know. Did she need some sort of placebo to make her better? I don't know. Was Mary actually injured in the ice? Certainly she was. Did she make claims that when she read the Bible, she made this discovery and she was healed? Yes, she did. But there is still a problem associated with Mary's story. Was Mary lying about all of this? Was she being less than truthful? Her doctors seem to contradict Mary's reports of healing. Dr. Alvin Cushing, in a 1,000-word statement, denied that Mary was ever in any incurable state. So there's a conflict between Mary's report and the report of the doctors. Mary claims she slips and falls and she's about to die. The doctor says, no, Mary was never in any peril of death. She slipped and was injured, but she wasn't going to die. And they denied Mary's own claim based on medical research, on science. But what was the influence of this event on the cult? This was considered to be, for all intents and purposes, the beginning of Christian Science. This would lead to the founding of the First Church of Christ Scientists in Boston, Massachusetts. It would also lead to the publication of Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures by Mary Baker Eddy, which is still the publication that is used by Christian scientists to this very day. And eventually the group would begin to grow and begin to expand. So Mary would eventually divorce Patterson. He would come back from the war. They would divorce for whatever reason. She would marry a final time to a man, Asa Gilbert Eddy, which is where she would come to her most famous name, Mary Baker Eddy. She was married to Asa Gilbert Eddy, thus the name, Mary Baker Eddy. And the group would begin to grow, begin to expand. And Mary would die on December the 3rd, 1910, which is in direct conflict to the teachings of Christian Science. They don't claim to believe in a material world. They don't claim to believe in death. But Mary dies. And that puts the church in a difficult place in 1910 at the passing of Mary Baker Eddy. She taught that death was, quote, an illusion. So after her death, there was definitely some questioning, doubt, and ridicule surrounding Christian Science. Some of the Christian Science scientists, practitioners, believed that Mary would be resurrected and raised from the dead. Others wondered if she could actually really be dead, since death was an illusion. In their mind, death did not even exist. So if death didn't exist, then Mary wasn't actually dead. There's this conflict between their supposed idea of reality and of reality itself. And outside of Christian Science, evangelical Christians would sort of begin to scoff and to mock at Christian Science. Matter of fact, I believe it was Billy Sunday that is quoted as having said this. If old Mother Eddy rises from the dead, I'll eat polecat for breakfast and wash it down with booze. Like I said, I believe that was Billy Sunday that said that. Sounds a little bit rude, if you ask me. A little feel kid-esque. But, he said it. But in modern day Christian Science, today the group operates under a board of directors and has really seen a decline in growth since around World War II. The reasons for this, there are several reasons that we could discuss. Modern medicine has advanced since World War II, so actual science. A lack of evangelization effort on their part. Now, Christian scientists do not go out and evangelize. So like many of the cults that we've talked about or may discuss in the future, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, they will actually come to your door, knock on the door, and attempt to share their message with you. Well, don't ever expect to get a knock on the door from a Christian scientist saying, let me share the gospel of Christian Science. That is not what they do. It's not in their methods. What they do, they have a sort of a building that doesn't look unlike a church. Inside of these buildings, they have what are referred to as reading rooms. You can go in and read Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. It's referred to as their sort of impersonal pastor, so there's no clergy within the group. They want folks to read the Bible and Science and Health, and that helps to bring one into Christian Science. I don't believe they even actually have any type of membership. So the group has fallen off because of lack of evangelization efforts. Also, the rise of feminism and more career opportunities for women, which is interesting because Mary Baker Eddy herself seemed to be more of an advocate for feminism without realizing that in the future, as women would become, quote, empowered, they wouldn't need Mary Baker Eddy's teachings. They could think on their own. They didn't need the Christian Science Church. So it really backfired on them. And then really just the general dying off of older members. No newer, younger members are coming in. Older members are dying out, and the church is dying off. I want to say that there are somewhere in the neighborhood of between 50,000 and 100,000 Christian scientists in America present day, depends on the numbers that you look at, and around 400,000 worldwide. Not a large cult at all, not a large group when you consider the millions of Jehovah's Witnesses, the millions of Mormons that exist, and within almost any group, there are large numbers. Christian Science groups have fallen off and may continue to fall off. We'll see what happens in the future. Is Christian Science dying? Possibly. But their influence still exists in the world. They're still out there. They may not be referred to as Christian Science, but the influence, that new thought, still very much exists in the world today. But Christian Science, what type of a cult are they? There's really, I think, two factors that we can look at, maybe two designations we can give them. Number one, Christian Science is what we would consider one of the mind science cults. There are several that fall under them, Christian Science being the most well-known of the mind science cults. But basically, all problems and issues exist in and can be dealt with through the mind. Sin, sickness, God, everything can be approached in what they refer to or has been referred to as some psychotherapic way in the mind. It's a mind science group. Also, it's a personality cult. Mary Baker Eddy is the driving force of Christian Science, much like Charles Taze Russell for a long time was the driving force of Jehovah's Witnesses, Joseph Smith with Mormonism, Marshall Applewhite with Heaven's Gate, Jim Jones with the People's Temple. Many cults are driven by the personality of their leader. Well, Christian Science was one of those personality cults. They depended very much on their leader to sort of guide them along. And well, after Mary Baker Eddy dies, the cult hasn't really had a strong identity. They seem to have a sort of an identity crisis. They refer back strongly to Mary Baker Eddy's teachings. Well, similar to Ellen G. White with Seventh-day Adventism. I don't believe Seventh-day Adventism is a cult, but I do believe that Ellen White was a false teacher, and I hope and I pray that someday they will venture away from Ellen White. Well, the same deal with Mary Baker Eddy and Christian Science. It was a personality-driven cult. Okay. Now, there's much, much, much more that we could say in reference to Christian Science. We haven't even discussed their doctrine, their views of sin, of God, of their denial of the Trinity, denial of Scripture. We barely mentioned reading rooms. What they refer to as MAM, the animal magnetism. So there's a lot of doctrine that we haven't even gotten into. But suffice to say, Christian Science views the world in a very Matrix-like fashion. You know, you take the red pill of Christian Science and you begin to see the world as it really is, or that they would like for you to believe that it is. But sadly, the reality is that all groups that do not submit to the final authority of Christ and the Bible and these supposed self-discoveries, all of these will just lead to error. And if you could pull back the curtain, if you could take the mask off of Christian Science, you would undoubtedly see that it is not God that is pushing these groups forward. On the contrary, it's actually fueled by Satan. And it leads to error. But what's the point of all of this? If Christian Science is dying, why should we even be concerned? Why even do an episode on Christian Science? The concern is this. The same elements of mind over matter are still in the church today through things like the Word of Faith movement, name it and claim it doctrine, the false teachings of things like the power of positive thinking, living your best life now, and just this general idea of this world being as good as it gets. That's not what Scripture teaches. Never has been, to live for this world, to make this world as good as we can. Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. Therefore, if you've been raised up with Christ, keep seeking the things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on things on the earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory. So what's the point of it all? Christian Science may be dying, but there are those that are opposed to Christianity by teaching this false gospel of mind over matter, thinking about things the right way and making them such. But as Christians, we're called to look outside of the world. Not how can the world be made better by how we can think about it, but how can we look outside the world and that we can look at Christ. Guys, this has been a quick episode on Christian Science, but that's going to do it for this one. Till next time, grace and peace. I'll catch you later, guys.